Hello, everyone, and welcome to Writers Drinking Coffee. This is a podcast where a bunch of writers sit around, drink tasty beverages, and talk about writing, publishing, and the whole creative process. We do not censor ourselves, so consider us PG-13. Your host writers today are David Welsh and me, Jeannie Warner. This is episode 129, Alternative Steampunk with Lyndsie Clark. Welcome, Lyndsie.
Hi, happy to be here.
I'm so glad to have you. I mean, Lyndsie and I actually have known each other for quite some time and keep running into each other's paths. And the last time we ran in person, besides Penzic, was a steampunk convention in Seattle. Do you remember SteamCon?
I do. I miss it.
It was a really good time. I love steampunk conventions. What do you love about them besides the clothes?
Well, okay, I was going to say the clothes, but I really love being able to see all of the different ways that people can be creative with the steampunk aesthetic, not just with the physical clothing, but with their writing and their role-playing games or their board games or their art. And I think there's a huge opportunity in the pop culture nerddom world of having of doing a lot with steampunk, because it is it's got some specific roots, but it's kind of got a vague and open-ended back end. So you can kind of do whatever really with it.
It's true. And you can sort of take anything and just say, well, they could have had it in steampunk. There was so much invention going on. And more to the point, there was print and newsletters and papers finally starting to be published. So with printing advances, suddenly everybody could know about your cool.
I like them because it's all about brass tubing and hot air. So trumpet fits right in.
And, and a lot of men I know also.
Well, the trumpet player fits in too, then I guess.
Also fitting in there, yes. You wrote, Lyndsie, besides I love your short stories and I love some of the work that you've published on your website, you wrote a blog that sort of got me started on this and was originally we have to have you to come talk about this. It's a blog called Steampunk Beyond Colonialism. And somehow I feel like right now it is an appropriate time to start talking about how a lot of people think of Victoriana and steampunk, and they do. They think of the Queen, they think of London, and they think of all of the brass fittings and all of the many, many movies. But let's talk about colonialism and steampunk outside of it, right? What does steampunk look like in non-white cultures?
Yeah, so I think when you
Slavery.
Look at steampunk, right? Well, actually, a really amazing author that I met at a convention once told me, her name was Vanessa Robertson. She writes the Canithrope series. She said, and this line sticks with me and I love it, that there are no third world countries, just countries recovering from imperialism, which, made me start really thinking about this topic of the British imperialism and how we could get away from that. Because in steampunk, you look at the name specifically and steampunk has punk in it. And punk has always been about anti-establishment, going against the man, going against the norm. And the norm in the steampunk era was the Victorian culture, was the imperialistic white British, people, conquering, quote unquote, these other countries. So to think outside of that, I think we go down to the roots and say, okay, so what is against the white Victorian imperialistic man?
Right. And that's what I loved about, too, of saying we get so narrowly focused in that. But there were so many interesting things going on all around the planet. There were inventions. Latin America, for instance, I went to a Moron's Guide to Latin American History done by John Leguizamo, and I think I muffed up the title. So I'll fix it in the liner notes. But he sat down with his son to talk about famous Latin American generals in history, and he realized he didn't actually know any. And yet there's so many interesting ideas that you could be in Argentina, in Latin America is where we got the color TV, oral contraceptives, the electric brake used on trains. These are all offerings that had nothing whatsoever to do with London and the Queen and the Royal Guard. And yet at the same time, what is more steampunk than television?
A bunch of tubes and wires making magic things happen. That's totally...
I don't know if color television is steampunk.
I think it is. I'm calling 1880 to 1901 is fairly a steampunk time in there. And Hercule Florence was a French-Brazilian inventor, is considered one of the pioneers of photography before, Daguerre ever got involved with daguerreotypes,
Yeah, I mean, I could totally, especially early colored television, I could maybe see it even. I mean, if you even look at
Oh yeah,
look at the early colors, they aren't bright.
right. A box the size of a refrigerator and a screen the size of a postage stamp. Now that's early TV, black
Yeah.
and white or color.
Yeah, exactly. So I don't know. I'd go with it.
Yeah, and there was a lot going on interesting in the world. Singapore was one of the cores of shipping. So as shipping goes by, they had the best of everything, but I don't think I've ever read a steampunk novel out of Singapore. Have you guys?
No.
No. I tried to find one, and I was not super successful, and I was trying to track down the person who told me about it. But there was a whole Australian Southern Hemisphere style steampunk short story anthology, and I think it was called Steampunk Down Under. But I searched for it. I didn't put it in my blog because I couldn't find it, but I know it exists out there somewhere. And if anybody does know about it, I'd love to find it. But it was all about Australian writers, and a lot of them had to do with the native cultures of the Australian and New Zealand areas, and kind of how steampunk would look different down there. I don't know much more about it than that, but I like the idea and I want it.
Oh, and even within white culture, I mean, the Australians were kind of punk back then anyway. They were criminals. They were kind of by definition against the man.
Well, they definitely were. But I was also thinking, and this is one of those that I started the rabbit hole of research, which is probably one of my favorite things in the world. And it was discovering that there was between 1880 and 1886, nearly 500,000 immigrants went to South America from all over the place, to Italy, Spain, France, Russia, German, the Swiss, your Belgies. And that's a lot. And that is a major demographic shift. And
it was a lot back then.
It's a huge amount back then. Just in 6 years, 500,000 people. Mm-hmm. Like a national census, 1869 was saying there's 1.8 million people in Buenos Aires. In 1895, it was 4 million, of which a quarter of those were foreign born.
Yeah.
And yet in the 1880s, if you think of the 1880s in America, what do people think of? Well, cowboys.
Right. Well, these days, a particularly nasty cold can knock out 500,000 people in this country alone. So
this is truth. But there is such interesting diaspora of how humans have moved around for all different reasons in all different areas. And where did they go? And it wasn't just governed by creativity in big cities in like England, especially. You know, you get a lot of London or New York City. I'm thinking like Age of Innocence.
Yeah, and they all had kind of, you know, a lot of the places they had. I mean, some places, you know, they had a bunch of like water power, for instance, was big in areas where there was coastal communities, and you know, water power can ultimately lead to steam power. And I was kind of doing a little bit of research about that as well, how like a possibly, you know, island-driven culture could use water power to power these electrical contraptions as well.
Hydropunk.
I like it.
Ooh. Wait a second. Does this lead to Waterworld?
But I hope not.
Oh, maybe actually.
No. I can see it. It's really, you know, the forcing of water through a tighter area. How do you just need to do the condensing. I was reading some of the recent ideas. They had storing power. How do you store power without huge attenuation over distance and storing? And one of them was a gal that came up a way of saying they were already using air, you know, compressed air. What if it was compressed cold, wet air? Because that condenses so much better than hot air or other kinds of air, which leads to the hydro. You know, if you condensed cold, wet air in caves, you have a lot of possibility.
Yeah, I mean, they're definitely like cold. I mean, cold air can store a lot of potential. It sounds miserable, but I can see it. You can see it working.
Well, it just reminded me of the creativity of humans in their environments using what's available. And in particular, there was a place in Africa where somebody created a coolant wall. And by a coolant wall, they had sawed off the ends of a whole bunch of 2-liter containers. You know, the rounded part where it scoops down into a funnel-like shape and comes out the top. They just cut those off, and then they embedded it in brick, and you sit behind it. And it takes the hot air coming at you and turns it into a cool air just by condensing it and shoving it together. And I'm like, that's crazy. That doesn't work. So everybody who's listening to this right now, exhale onto your hand and it comes out hot, right? But when you make some kind of embouchure like you're going to blow a whistle of something. When you blow, the wind is cool, just because it's that same hot air, but going through a smaller aperture makes it cold.
Or just go look up the ideal gas law. PV over T equals.
Well, you could, but some of us slept through that part of chemistry.
Well,
Yeah, some of us got bored when you said formula.
How can you have steampunk without science?
I mean, that is also very true.
Experimentation can create its own part of science, and writing down what happens of your experimentation.
Right.
One does not have to know what has gone before to recreate them in.
It sure helps. Otherwise, you're reinventing the wheel.
Yes, but what if you don't have a textbook in another country and you're needing to invent a wheel?
Then you're recovering from colonialism.
I mean, and that kind of brings me to a point that I was thinking of with other cultures having discovered different things that would be equally as steam cool as steam power, if not even coming up with steam power on their own. But, one of the thoughts of, trying to get away from the British colonialism idea of all of that, when, you take, like I said, you take aspects of a culture that are integral to the culture, like you think of like a South American culture that, in Argentina or somewhere like low where it's high plains and super windy. You've got all that potential stored there that they would, be able to harness because it's, high plains and it's got, not a lot of obstruction to the wind. And so that could be the birth of some kind of a steampunk-esque similar era aesthetic, but with a whole different base of power.
Well, the whole steampunk, let's talk about that because you don't want to talk about science. The steampunk aesthetic comes from all the accoutrement of engineering of the era, particularly in Europe and in the West. So, what would one of these other regional steampunk? What would the culture look like? Would it actually still be steampunk? Without hydropunk. Is it still like low tech evolving into high tech sort of effects, or is it? Because it seems like it's all kind of part and parcel to the technological development of the era.
To a certain extent, I could see that, but then you imagine like the ether ship imagination that Chaz has used for his crater schools of the ether ships that sail between here and Mars, again, presupposing that Mars could support an atmosphere, etc. Mm-hmm. If you're setting it at the time, you're allowed to use what people thought at the time.
Right. Yeah.
You can look at some of the turn of the century black and white pictures that were done, the Melières.
So now you've got not only the alternative technologies of these different cultures, but also their misconceptions as well.
Well, the imaginations of them, absolutely.
You say potato, I say potato.
Well, people do it in fantasy. If you looked at everywhere around the world has a different idea of vampires. And whether you like Anne Rice or not, when you get to Queen of the Damned, she really did try to write, the first universal vampire theory that I'd ever really seen of, really every vampire myth is true. And they are interpreted different ways with these different, classes of, go read the book if you want, but that it was still just taking something from everywhere and saying, everybody has this general idea. How did they all get it? And maybe it's real. And what if it was real? And it really is just one giant what if, isn't it?
Right.
What if there was something that was a better fuel than coal?
That's true of all speculative fiction of any stripe, though. It's
exactly.
What if?
Yeah, well, and one of my thoughts when you say, what would a culture look like if it wasn't based on, whatever the British ideals of anything related to steampunk? The one I came up with that I think would be pretty recognizable by a lot of people is Wakanda. I kind of feel as a steampunk society. It's a little on the fantasy end, and I have my own feelings about how it's actually portrayed as like, the noble savage type thing, which is a total trope in itself. But as far as its technology and the way that it's got flying ships, it's got like ground-based transportation that moves on some kind of unknown power. It's got this
magic vibranium
that drives everything.
It's all based on a fictional resource that only that country has and can exploit.
But how is that not steampunk in a sense of in the aesthetic way, right? Like they were
well, I mean, I
lower
guess that
culture going to
that
higher
in a
tech.
way is kind of my point. If you're pointing to that as an example, that does, to me, it doesn't feel like or look like steampunk. Maybe it's just the visual.
I mean, I
I
think
mean,
like
it's all
steampunk is an idea.
slick and modern looking as opposed to clunky
Kinda.
and huh?
I mean, I don't know. If you look at some of the artist renditions of some of the stuff, it looks a little bit more steampunk than you would think. Like, I don't know. You go based on just the Hollywood movie, yeah, okay, but it's
Well, that's all
Hollywood.
I've seen. I
Um,
don't haven't looked at any of the.
so
Um,
I've looked at. I mean, I've gone through some of the images and artist renditions and some of the other people's takes, and a lot of it is it's more natural looking. Like it looks like the mountains around it, which kind of makes me back to like less modern, you know.
yeah,
And even though they have these kind of fancy technologies, they still
yeah.
have kind of their roots. And you know, but I mean, you know, to answer in my thought to answer the question of like, you know, is it actually steampunk? My first my first answer and my snarky answer is, well, you don't have to be so literal. But
Oh no, go with the snarky answer. That's my go-to 9 times out of 10. Anyway,
It really is for him. And well, I was thinking like Gail Carriger, whom I simply adore. She did urban supernatural. If you think of urban supernatural, here's vampires and werewolves and other sorts of things. And she set them in a steampunk setting in which there are absolutely zeppelins and the prevalency of flying machines, which were slightly more than they really were. And all of the ideas just taken into the what if this was mainstream. And I think to me, that's what the essence of steampunk then is, of saying, what if? You know, there's a little bit of fantasy in every single element of it, and that's okay. And I think you can move steampunk a little bit forward into science fiction a little bit too. I mean, it is technically a flavor of science, isn't it?
well, it's technically a flavor of science fiction. It's got both elements, right?
Exactly.
It's got science, well, engineering, and fiction.
So there we are. Let's go with Chaz's theory that we've colonized Mars suddenly, and suddenly reality comes up to everybody, and they discover that each of ships can't possibly fly in so suddenly because nobody believes in them anymore. They don't work. So now you have a whole bunch of people stranded on Mars with their tech breaking down. It strikes me that you're in it's almost like Robinson Crusoe. I think Jonathan Swift. Wait.
Right.
You know who I mean. Suddenly you're cast away on an island without any support anywhere, practically no hope of rescue. You have to use what you have, which is going to be rapidly decaying and dying, and come up with something new. That's kind of steampunky, isn't it?
I think so. And I definitely think, I mean, one of my other big thoughts with the steampunk technology is one of the arguments that I had is that steampunk technology doesn't just make rich people's lives better. The steampunk technology that we see, even in the Victoriana stuff, is it kind of makes the average Joe's life better, makes common folks' life better without them having to be beholden to some higher power, upper class, you know, overlord, whatever. Basic little things that can improve, you know, day-to-day functionality among working class people.
Really? How? Because, I mean, in normal kind of Victoriana sort of Oliver Twist land, the common people's lives really kind of sucked pretty hard.
I mean, that's because the common people's lives sucked in the actual Victorian era. But if you actually get away from that and you look at initial, like the beginning books of like science fiction or of steampunk, it's more reflected on normal people using this technology rather than the upper class. The upper class kind of got, like, in the resurgence of steampunk in like the 2000s, when we were, you know, all wanting to be hoity-toity fancy bitches, totally came back. But at the very beginning of it, back in like the, I don't know, whatever it was, 80s.
I'm going to say, let's go back to the 1960s and the Wild Wild West, which was my favorite steampunk. I watched that series like clockwork. I own it now. Thank you. If they reduced it on DVD. But he lived on a train and he traveled around, and Artemis Gordon was constantly, like any magician, inventing new little mechanical devices that did things he wanted them to do.
That's exactly what I was trying. That's exactly what I was trying to. But something like that, yeah. And I think, like I said, when the 2000s rolled around, the millennium, and we're so fancy because we're the millennium now, things changed. And like, it's really interesting how things changed, because I kind of started steampunk right around that time. And initially I started steampunk with a bunch of people who grew up in the 1980s punk scene. And so my steampunk introduction was way more normal class people rather than hoity-toity Victorian people, which is very interesting to me, because it was a bunch of people that were, you know, older than me, that had been teenagers in the 80s, that had this different idea of what steampunk should be. And when it started becoming big, that's kind of what I got into. And then later it turned into fancy Victorian dresses and all that stuff. So,
Well, I have a hypothesis for you. You can discuss and or reject it if you like. In the beginning, well, the movement from like this imagined steampunk middle class to the technology belonging to all the hoity-toity Victorian wealthy people was because in the beginning there wasn't as much or as good a research, and people didn't realize that, well, the middle class didn't really exist as much per se in the Victorian era. So we kind of projected and said, oh, okay, so, we're middle class, and the middle class, it's just like.
Which is dead wrong. Sorry.
Well.
So, my question is, are we reenactors or are we cosplayers? Are we science fictioners or are we?
Well, I didn't start the discussion of.
I hold that, I'm cosplay, but when they start digging into it, I mean, I have witnessed K.W. Jeter saying in person in no uncertain terms that he invented the term. And it's like, well, jolly good for you, but I worked for IBM and they made counting machines on F of Charles Babbage's difference engines, etc. And you could say that anywhere, and then you have a machine that counted things. And if you have something that counts things, then you can create anything.
Yeah, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that it's a bad thing to do this imaginative or revisionist. Revisionism might be a little loaded, but that sort of thing, because I mean, with any sort of cosplay or thing where you're like inventing a world that's based on an existing world, you kind of edit out the bad stuff. I mean, we could talk about how horrible colonialism really was, which, kind of was what I thought we were going to be doing at the beginning, but
we still can.
We haired off on technology for some reason, but I mean, if you're cosplaying steampunk, you kind of, it's problematic, right? You're either kind of making fun of the colonialist aspects of it, or you're ignoring it completely, and just, digging the costumes and the technology, or, you're not walking around with a lot of racist language or whatever the racist language was back then. I mean,
the punk rebellion, though, I think is key to it in a lot of ways, especially in the hands of maybe a lot of female writers. There's an interesting thing of women being able to be competent and defend themselves with steampunk where they couldn't in real life. Like, for instance, some of us remember that really long hat pins became illegal for a time because women were using them on the street against men that were copping a feel. And it was considered to be, oh, no, men are getting hurt by this. We should take the hat pins away, without anybody saying, maybe we shouldn't fondle women in public. But
yeah, that's exactly. And one of the, as far as steampunk literature goes, there's a, Carrie Vaughn does the short story series, Harry and Marlowe. And yeah. Harry is the Princess Henrietta from the Victorian era. And she goes off on steampunk adventures with her general, captain of the guard, or somebody in her army, and they go on like airships, and it's a steampunk thing where she dresses as a boy, and like it's kind of based on some factual stuff where I think the princess would actually dress as a boy and go sneak out, but it's based on like it's a steampunk one, and it was one of my first introductions into a lot of like steampunk literature, and in her world the steampunk technology is from aliens that crash landed on Earth, and so they were using alien technology to power stuff as well as steam. But it just had this female character that was, a female princess, like upper class, but like sneaking out, hanging with the soldiers, having adventures, which I think really fits the punk aspect of steampunk, and got me. One of the reasons why that got me super interested in kind of the genre, like the possibility of fiction.
Yeah, I mean, I take your point. I guess at cons, especially with just the cosplay and excuse me, that kind of stuff. I think the steam is emphasized, and you don't see as much of the punk sort of.
Oh, I don't know. I've seen an awful lot of fishnet that would beg to disagree because.
Well, I mean,
I was going to say I've seen a lot
punk
of
in the sense, not. I mean, punk in the sense of it being a rebellion or a reaction to colonial / white male dominated culture.
Well, was the rise of steampunk also because we were really entering a digital age and everything was suddenly online, and I wonder if some of the writings that became really big, as you were pointing out in the 80s and 90s, were they kind of a reaction? Were people taking refuge in the past and saying, I want science fiction, but I want old science fiction?
Yeah, and I mean that, there's something to that kind of like alternate past future, I guess. I don't know. Like if steampunk became the thing that was powerful and rather than like, gasoline or whatever, and how that progressed toward the future. I think there's kind of refuge in the alternate future thing. Like maybe things would be better if we did X, Y, and Z instead of what we had done, right?
Well, and I would posit that the diehard people can shoot at me, and I know Dave probably will when I say this, but is an ether ship to Mars any crazier than a warp drive?
Yeah, no, I don't think so at all.
No.
Yeah.
No. Well,
I'm all on
that
board for either,
kind of begs the question, why do some alternate histories or alternate universes catch on so well, like steampunk, and like the Star Trek universe, and some don't? I mean, why don't we have bronze punk or stone punk or
Renpunk?
What?
Renpunk?
Renpunk or fairy punk? Those are ones that.
Well, and I'm sure they're I'm sure they're niche markets, but you don't hear nearly as much about them, and they're not as big in this world of digital online mashups. Like everything exists now. I can't make the argument that it doesn't exist, but I'm asking why is steampunk so popular? Why did it blow up the way it did, rather than something else?
Okay, I have a theoretical answer and I have a more practical answer. My more practical answer was somebody talking at one of the conventions I was at, and they were in like somewhere in the Midwest, and the steampunk convention started getting big, and they just didn't have it was a very conservative area. They were very religious, and there was like a very structured, like this is the norm. And steampunk somehow showed up in there and became this inclusive place for all the weirdos to go. Weirdos, quote unquote, in the sense of didn't follow the standard conservative, whatever, people who were alternate genders, alternate sexualities, alternate culture, super nerdy, related to science fiction, related to fantasy. And it kind of drew in a lot of people from a lot of different genres, and it kind of drew them into an aesthetic that had very, very clear definitions of how to be that aesthetic. Gears, clocks, brown, green, crazy guns made out of scrap,
Glasses and hats.
Hats, pipes.
Right.
And so you could take whatever nerddom, fantasy, science fiction aesthetic you wanted and kind of bring it into steampunk and kind of add a couple things and be included into a social group of people that would pretty much accept you. One of the things somebody said was that the steampunk subculture in like the US has been far more inclusive than a lot of other science fiction.
Okay. I like that answer. I'll buy that. So what's your theoretical answer?
Wait, I wanted to add one more point onto that if I can. We experienced that out here in the Bay Area, that the steampunk Clockwork Alchemy, which was fabulous, was part of BayCon, but then it kind of got shuffled aside because some of the people decided, I don't know, maybe that it just wasn't serious enough as the true literature people that wanted to, talk in BayCon. Whereas the Comic-Con people said, hey, we like wearing costumes. You like wearing costumes. Come, our brothers, let us all wear costumes together. The fact that mine has more latex and yours has more gear and, glass, cool.
Yeah. And that kind of goes into my theoretical example, which kind of goes into my practical example, which all kind of blurs together. So it's just one giant cluster of everything. But my theoretical example is that, like, I have attended the Colorado Steampunk Convention every year but two. One of them was actually 2020, even though they had it was pre-pandemic. And then I think like the very first one they had. And I've done everything from, I've done steampunk, I've done, cyberpunk-ish post-apocalyptic steampunk. I've done dieselpunk steampunk. I've done fantasy steampunk. I've done underwater steampunk. I've done a bunch of other stuff. It's general enough in its umbrella description that you can kind of you can do anything with it. And it all just kind of fell under the umbrella of steampunk, which is why earlier I gave you a hard time about being so literal, because I think the actual subculture, it doesn't really give a shit about steam. In a lot of ways.
No,
only
I'll
a small
buy that.
subsector of the steampunk culture actually does steam related stuff.
Yeah. And I think the way I rationalize that as I'm listening to you is, look, it's a made up culture based on some historical sorts of things, but it's not trying to recreate history. It's trying to twist it into something else. And furthermore, it's a loose genre that contains all these tangents that you were just mentioning. So if you're going to a convention, then, the whole point is to kind of groove on one of these things and have high production values and be cool. It's not to be authentic in some way, like playing SCA in some areas or with some groups or historical reenactors or something.
It's also very open. It is open to people with different challenges and physical disability in ways that some of the other reenactment groups might not be.
Well, right, but the question then is that because it's so inclusive of all this other stuff and you can't really say no, or is it the other way around? Is it just a bunch of inclusive people who have landed on a genre that happens to look inclusive?
Yeah, because I do think, I think too, going back to the whole colonialism thing, I think this is why steampunk can really, really efficiently accommodate other cultures, and you don't have to, be so fixated on Victoriana in steampunk because of this kind of inclusive mentality. And not just in the cosplay world or the social get together world. Like if you look at literature too, and some of, one of the books I found, which I haven't actually read yet, because my to be read list is very long, but there's a book called The Gunpowder Alchemy, part of the Gunpowder Chronicles. And it's a Chinese-based steampunk-esque world that bases off of what technology China was developing at the same time period. There's that one, and then there's all kinds of cosplayers that have a culture of their own that they grew up in, Indian or Middle Eastern or African, that have incorporated some of the cultural aspects of their culture into steampunk, or steampunk into their culture, or vice versa. And it easily is believable. As much as cyberpunk is dear to my heart, I have a little bit of a harder time. It's way more specific than steampunk is, just based on what's out there.
Of all of this, where do you love writing, as I say, and what are you working on in a steampunk world right now?
So I do have a concept. It's kind of been backburnered since I'm trying to finish my cyberpunk series, but I do have a concept of a steampunk. Well, I guess it starts being Renpunk because it starts with Leonardo, but eventually it's going to be a novel, and it's going to be like a typical maybe adventure story with a steam, and I think it's going to have aliens, but it'll be in the steampunk world, set actually in the Middle East, with steampunk adventurers from the Middle East searching for lost stuff from Leonardo da Vinci. So, incorporate some of my medieval nerdism as well as steampunk. I don't have a title for it yet, but
I was going to say, it sounds like you're a little bit of a plotter rather than just a full-on pantser, or
I am a plotter, yes, to the core now. I used to be a pantser, and after rewriting an entire 2 novels, I decided that plotting is probably smart. So
what advice would you give a new person just starting out in this then? They want to write. Maybe they want to write steampunk. Besides reading steampunk, what would you advise?
Besides reading steampunk? Well, my biggest piece of advice for anybody with any genre is I definitely suggest doing some research first. Obviously, try not to rabbit hole, because we all do that, and then it could prevent you from writing. But my biggest advice for a new writer of any genre is, and I'm going to get a lot of glares and snarls from people for this advice, but don't sit down and just write something unless that something is a plan. Even if it's a small plan, even if it's like 6 bullet points of like beginning, sub-beginning, middle, and end. But I definitely feel like having at least a higher goal overall plan will serve you super well in your writing. Because if you write just what you feel like, you're going to be rewriting them. And if that's what you want to do, that's cool. That's on you. Have fun with it.
Fair enough. Well, we will put links to all the things that we've mentioned on our website, which is www.writersdrinkingcoffee.com. Lyndsie, thank you so much for coming with us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
You've been listening to Writers Drinking Coffee, a labor of love and enthusiasm put together by the hosts. Our main web support magic is by Deirdre Schween, and our sound engineer, backup web spider, and host is David Welsh. Our intro music is Pretty Maid Milking a Cow, and our exit music is Breakfast with a Morning Person, both by Michael Engberg. You can hear more from Michael Engberg on manyhatsmusic.com. Our podcast sponsor is your favorite coffee shop. Go write something there today. And hey, Thanks for listening.